In this video, we're going to talk about some of the sociocultural theories that you learned about for this week, and some of the ways that they've been taken up to inform our understanding of second language acquisition. So for starters, just as a brief overview of what sociocultural theory is, as you learned about for this week, sociocultural theory was developed from the work of Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky. And Vygotsky was really interested in how humans learn and develop. And he started to realize that some of that learning and development doesn't just happen within the mind, but happens through interactions with other people, with tools and artifacts that we encounter in the world. So he was really interested in how those interactions and our engagement with those different cultural tools mediated learning. So sociocultural theory is interested in how social interaction and culture shape learning. And one idea that's come out of this theory is this idea of learning as apprenticeship. Children are apprenticed into learning. And I've picked a couple images, I think, that kind of embody this focus on social interaction and culture and thinking about apprenticeship, right? Learning to ride a bike. The skills that one develops engaging with the bicycle itself, but also a more capable adult person who already knows how to ride, who's then kind of apprenticing a child into that skill. And certainly some learning dance, we know, is very rooted in cultural traditions and different ways in which different groups have designed come up with ways to move their bodies with music. And so the ways in which children learn how to do things, even how to move, those are all rooted in interaction and culture. And a concept that's come out of sociocultural theory that was introduced by Vygotsky and has been very influential in the field of education is this idea of the zone of proximal development that I know we've talked about already, and you've likely encountered in other courses you've taken, especially in your early education coursework. And this idea, again, is that people learn when they're in the space between what they can already do and what they can't do. So that's the space of what they can do with help, which Vygotsky referred to as the zone of proximal development. So these ideas became popular in the educational world in the 1980s and 90s, and have been very influential as well in the field of second language acquisition. One additional idea to talk about before we begin to dive into language learning is scaffolding, which isn't a term that Vygotsky introduced, but it's built upon Vygotskyan ideas, especially that idea of a zone of proximal development. So a scaffold is the idea of represents a temporary support that a teacher provides a student that enables the student to do a task, perform a task that he or she would not be able to perform alone. So the same idea of scaffolding around a building that's put up as temporary supports so that the building can be constructed and then taken down. Scaffolding is designed in that same way. So what are some supports that can help a child get into that zone of proximal development? And then when the child has mastered that skill or that knowledge, the scaffolds can be removed. And I wanted to come back to Cummins quadrants. We talked about this in a previous week because it really kind of connects to that idea of scaffolding. So you might recall that Jim Cummins introduced this way of thinking about learning as a set of quadrants, moving from cognitively undemanding or something that's not challenging to cognitively demanding, something challenging. And then from context embedded or something that has a lot of context surrounding it, connects to learners' experiences. You can actually engage with whatever it is in front of you. So it's easy to make sense of it, to something that is more abstract or context reduced. So it's hard to connect to one's own experience. You don't have whatever it is you're talking about or writing about, learning about directly in front of you. So we can think about this. I'll give you an example, and then we can think about how scaffolding applies here. So for example, something that would fall into this quadrant of Context embedded and cognitively undemanding might be students in a third grade classroom watching an engaging video that has a song about doing division with things that they can connect to. So they can see images of soccer balls and they're being grouped. And so they're learning about division through song, through this very engaging video, right? Not super challenging to watch a video, and very embedded in, they can see the images, it can connect to their own experiences. Something that's a bit more cognitively demanding, but remains in this space of context embedded, is then having students use manipulatives with their peers to model division problems. So they have objects in front of them, which gives it context, but it's more challenging because now they're actually having to do the work of figure out the division problems. Then we move to something that's context reduced, such as taking a math test about division, right? So it's cognitively demanding, this is difficult, and now they don't have the manipulatives, the peers, any visuals, and they're just working with math problems and having to solve them. And finally, something that might fall into cognitively undemanding and context reduced might be having students do, when they finish their math test, do a quick worksheet practicing near addition problems, right? So something that students have already mastered, they know how to do it, so it's not very challenging, still abstract. We're not working with anything that's context embedded in front of us. We're looking at numbers and abstractly adding them together, but it's not that challenging. So Cummins argued that we should try to have most of the learning activities in our classroom happen in this space of high context and cognitively demanding, right? And that is the scaffolding zone. That is the space between what a child cannot do yet and what they can do, and what they already know how to do, right? That space of what they can do with help. So that is where learning happens, and that is where Cummins and others have argued that we should put our attention for language learning as well. And when we think about scaffolding, I have a few more slides I want to present on scaffolding. And again, this is about learning in general, but definitely applies when we think about supporting language learners. We can think about scaffolding both across a lesson. So you may be familiar with this idea of a gradual release of responsibility, where we begin with the teacher modeling something, and then doing something as a whole class we do together, and then moving towards students doing something in a group or with a peer, and then doing it independently. So this gradual release where students are supported as they engage with a new skill. So they're not told, here's a sheet of division problems, figure it out, but the teacher models, we try it together, they work in small groups, and then they do it on their own, right? So that's scaffolding across a lesson. And then we can also think about scaffolds within a lesson. So the specific supports that are being put in place so that a student can engage with the content. So getting into that quadrant zone of something that's challenging, but also really context embedded. And so for language learners, and even for students who are not learning a language, we often use things like sentence frames. So kind of giving them sample language to get them started, or where they fill in a word, but the rest of it is provided, using visuals. For our language learners, giving them home language supports, all different ways we can provide scaffolds within a lesson. And I often like to think about these in 4 different categories. So linguistic scaffolds, anything involving language, like I mentioned, sentence frames, but also providing students with a word bank. So they have some words to choose from when they're engaging with an activity. Giving them a bilingual glossary, so they have the words in their home language. Cognate walls, creating a wall with all of the different cognates that are connected to what you're learning in a unit, so they can see the way that their home language is connected to new learning in English. Providing text in their home language. Visual and sensory supports, like Realia, are actually getting to work with the objects themselves. If they're learning about pumpkins, bring in a pumpkin. Pictures, diagrams, songs, total physical response, so moving their body as they learn a new word. So if they're learning verbs, having students actually jump and sit to learn what those words mean. Or if they're learning about angles, have them use their bodies to actually make different angles that they're learning about in math class. Graphic scaffolds like Venn diagrams, brainstorm webs, timelines, tables, those all help students organize information and see how things are connected, and they help reduce some of the linguistic demand of the text that they're engaging with or the ideas they're engaging with. And interactive scaffolds like working in a small group or working with a partner with some intention behind it. Sometimes it makes sense to have students work in groups with someone who shares a home language so they can draw upon that home language as they're discussing. Other times it makes sense to have students work with peers who are at different stages of second language acquisition or different stages of English language development, so they can support one another in those ways. So this is just, again, to give you some ideas of what this kind of scaffolding can look like. And all of this is again, rooted back in that idea, the concept of sociocultural theory, right, from Vygotsky, that we learn through interaction, that learning is apprenticeship, that learning is social and cultural, and that we learn when we're able to engage in these really supported types of ways. Okay. So that's just a brief overview of some of the concepts related to sociocultural theory that we talked about for this week. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about this ecological perspective on SLA, because it really has helped to move the field away from viewing second language acquisition as something that happens in the head of an individual learner, to think about the context in which the learner is engaging with the new language. And all of the different aspects of context that are shaping how that student comes to learn the language and also comes to see themselves within that space. So ecological perspectives often have their root in some of the work from people who looked at human development, like Brofenbrenner. So you can see kind of this embedded context model where an individual is embedded within like a microsystem of their immediate family and their school and their neighborhood, but then that goes further and further out into the larger communities in which they're embedded. So being in Rhode Island, and then some larger communities, their families' workplaces, the media, all the way out to the different ideologies and cultural values that are shaping that individual's experiences. So seeing learning not as something, again, in the individual mind, but as embedded in all of these multiple layers of context. And in the reading we had for this week, Maggie Hawkins did a great job of building upon this idea, but through the metaphor of a classroom as an ecosystem, which I think is a really helpful way to think about all the dynamic, the complexity and dynamics that are happening within a learning space, right? And that shifting one thing changes the learning space. But thinking about our classrooms as spaces where students are encountering texts and they're encountering their peers, they're encountering new learning, they're encountering policies, they're encountering all sorts of different ideologies about language and value and power. And those are shaping how they make sense of themselves and how they make sense of new learning and the language that they're learning. So it helps, I think, to think about all of those different facets as intersecting with the learner and their journey as they are acquiring a new language, not as something that's simply just happening in their mind. All right. Another idea that Hawkins talked about that I think is really helpful is this idea of language and literacy as multiple, right? So she also kind of pushes back against the idea that language is a thing and literacy is a thing, but saying, there are multiple ways of doing language and doing literacy. And it depends on the purpose for those different uses of text and of words. It depends on the different groups in which we are using that language or wanting to use that language. And one idea that she mentions that I think is helpful to think about is this idea of social languages, or what Jim G calls discourses, big D discourses, which are particular ways of languaging in different communities. So those of you who are practicing teachers, and even those of you who are not yet, but are learning to become teachers, have probably started to realize that teaching has its own language, right? And when you teach in different places, you see that there's a different language. But I remember the first time I used the word pedagogy with my parents, and they had no idea what I was talking about. And to me, that had become such a common word. It's a very common term in education that it was strange to me that someone who I think is fairly educated and connected to the world had never heard that term before, or didn't know what I meant by it. So we use words in particular ways when we're becoming members of particular groups. Certainly teaching has a wealth of acronyms that are always confusing to learn, and then you move to a new place and there's a whole wealth of new acronyms to learn. But there's certain ways of languaging like a teacher, right? Talking like a teacher. There's a social language or a particular discourse for being a teacher. Jim G, in his example, when he writes about this topic, talks about the language of being a biker, not the person out on their pedaling on the weekends, but like in a biker gang, what like the language that you use when you're a biker, that's got its own vocabulary, its own way of engaging with one another. That's unique to that community, right? Language of languaging like a scientist. Certainly if you've had a conversation with somebody who works in the sciences, you will notice there are particular ways of languaging, ways that ideas are communicated that are different from when you might just be having a conversation with a friend. There's ways of being a student. There's certain discourses around being a student. Discourses and practices too, right? So only in school do we ask people or children to raise their hand to say something, to share an idea, right? But we've built that practice in as part of the discourse of being a good student is raising your hand to be called on and not just shouting out your ideas when the teacher asks. So those are embedded within different communities. And I added one more in here, the discourse of being a snowboarder. So I've recently went skiing with a friend, and she was using all sorts of language or words and terms that I had never heard before, and I had no idea what she was referring to because she was so embedded in the discourse of snowboarding culture, right? So I think this idea helps us to move away from thinking about language as a thing and literacy as a thing to seeing that all languages are connected to the different communities that we're engaging with and the communities that we want to be a part of, right? So as we take on these different discourses, we're becoming different kinds of people who engage in different ways. All right, and then finally, I want to talk about, we're kind of moving into the path of identity, that sociocultural lenses on SLA and identity specifically. So as we learned about for this week, identity is fundamentally social. It's not just something that is inside us, but it's something that is constructed through interactions with others. And its language learning is very much tied to our identities. I love this quote from Bonnie Norton Pierce. She talks about how when language learners speak, they're not just exchanging information, they are organizing and reorganizing a sense of who they are and how they relate to the social world. So it's vital that we think about our students' identities and their identity negotiation as part of that process. And a concept that Norton introduced that you can see from the readings that I've used in my own work is this idea of investment, which she introduced as a way to rethink the term motivation, which very much focuses on the individual learner. A student can be motivated or they can be unmotivated, right? And that's something that's the learner's fault if they're unmotivated, right? To investment, which is, how do we think about the space that the learner is in and all of those different complex factors, right? All of the things in that ecosystem that might be shaping their investment and contributing to them investing in this process of learning a new language or not investing in it. Do they feel like the teacher supports them? Do they feel like their home culture and home language are valued in that space? Do they have friends? Do they feel like they can connect to the text that they're reading? Do they see this language and learning this language as having value for them outside of the classroom? All of those are questions that relate to investment and shape a learner's investment. So the way that Norton defines it is that the sociological construct of investment signals a learner's commitment to learn a language, given their hopes for the future and their imagined identities. So a lot of it is really forward thinking, right? What am I hoping that this will enable me to do? In this view, learners invest in the target language if they anticipate acquiring a wider range of symbolic and material resources that will increase the value of their cultural capital and social power. So I think this is sometimes a helpful way for us to think about how students are encountering a new language and engaging with a new language. And I want to end with this last slide because I often hear this in the work that I do since I work in bilingual education, that children in bilingual education are like sponges soaking up language. And I have this quote here from an article by Thomas and Collier where they talk about a parent talking about their sharing their daughter's experience in a two-way immersion program, saying that, she's learning French and English. And even when she's learning math and French, she's picking it up like a sponge. It's not even bothering her English. And while I do appreciate, that children often do acquire language quickly, I encourage us to move away from the metaphor of children as just absorbing language, because I think it sometimes the metaphor itself causes us to think about children as passive recipients of language rather than as active thinkers and sense makers who bring their identities and their own sense making into these spaces and have different reasons for engaging or not engaging with language learning. So I encourage you as you move forward in this class and begin to think about second language acquisition from these sociocultural perspectives, to think about the spaces in which you see language learners interacting with one another. And what about these ecosystems, these ecologies are shaping how students, how they learn a new language, their attitudes towards the new language, their opportunities to be able to acquire a new language, in the sense that they're making through this process. So that is all for this week. I look forward to learning about or seeing how you're making sense of all of this in the discussion board.